on the prophets of Jeremiah, who speak specifically on the offsprings of Beta Israel that will return from all the places they have been dispersed. And one more thing that I want to say, you know, there are Jews who make Aliyah and come and live in Israel. But there are more Jews who live outside of Israel. The Jewish diaspora is all over the world. And for us, it is the time to recognize, to understand that there is a large-scale Jewish diaspora in Ethiopia.
We came to Ethiopia because God dispersed the Beta Israel into the 4 cardinal directions. So we came down from Egypt. We came here following the shores of the Blue Nile. Others went to America, Germany.
Ba là, c'est la contraction de Banu, c'est-à-dire enfants. C'est les enfants de Yakou.
Yacouba, les enfants de Yakou.
Les enfants de Yakou. Yakou Banu.
Yacoub. C'est qui Yacoub?
Bon, on ne sait pas.
Yacoub, c'est l'un de nos ancêtres.
C'est l'ancêtre de Yacouba, des dents.
Purposes. All right, so this is I-24 News. We'll play this first, and then let's go through both of them, so then you have to go back and forth. So the first one we'll play is this I-24 News, and it talks about, you know, this lady, doctor. She's basically talking about the Ethiopian Jews that's in these secret communities living to this day. It's going to be very important that you listen to some of the verbiage that she's going to use. So she's going to talk about how there were people before the modern day Jews, right, Judaism, that basically were part of the first temple period and not the second temple period. And she's going to talk about halakha, like we've been talking about before. Halakha is, you know, like the conversion process. And she's going to say, talk about, you know, about the conversion pieces and stuff. So it's going to be important to understand why, you know, the Ethiopian Jews are so important for us, because we have their DNA within us as well. And it's just not Ethiopian. I should have put it up. Maybe next week. We won't be talking about this for a little while. But maybe next week, Will, if I remember, we'll put up the DNA so people can see how that Ethiopian and Ethiopian Jew DNA is within African Americans. All right. So it connects us back to that trail I've been telling you about that started in Israel, went to Egypt, well, different places really, but Egypt or Sudan, and then or Yemen, and then they migrated to the west, to go to West Africa, to South Africa, to East Africa, to all around different Africa as they were running out of Israel being persecuted, or even Spain and Portugal, right? So it's very important to understand those roots and this migration of how it all started. In the next video is, I don't think a lot of people actually know, I don't know who S. Benzel is, but they had this on their YouTube page, and I think it was very good because it was short. But a lot of people don't understand the Ethiopian Jews. They call them the Falasha, which means strangers, a derogatory word. Just like Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi was a derogatory word, but they have accepted it now. So kind of like how they were calling people, like I think I heard people talking about Gullah Geechee. Geechee was really a derogatory word, but they have now accepted it. So, you know, those are some of the things about these Falasha Jews. They really should be called Beta Israel, the house of Israel, what they call themselves, or Ethiopian Jews. So these are the two videos to give you a little bit more information to start us off on this journey to talk about the Ethiopian Jews, where they are now. Where they were then and how all this started, and also, you know, some more of the modern day things as well. All right. The one I show first with the woman. You got it?
We are very honored to have the pleasure of being joined once again by Dr. Malka Shabtai, an applied anthropologist who is unraveling so much history and evidence of the lost tribes of Israel. Thank you for joining us again, and welcome back after a successful journey in Ethiopia. Tell us how your trip was.
First of all, this is my fourth time in the last 3 years to visit this community. Each time, more and more things are revealed to me as they trust me more and as they see our work in collaboration. This time, I went there for two goals. One, to complete my filming for the movie I'm making, and second, to go together and bring with me Kesaviu as a representative of the spiritual leadership of Ethiopian Jews in Israel.
Where in Ethiopia is this village? Is it urban or it's remote?
The geography is something to explain. The community is spread besides of a neighborhood in Addis Ababa called Kachane. The community is spread in several cities and in 15 secret synagogues in the region of Semi and Shoa.
Wow! And for you to be studying this your whole life, and yourself going to school, an academic, learning filmmaking, you're making this all by yourself. I know you have a lot of responsibilities. This is quite a journey for you. So to come and film this time, and then have the success after coming back must be so special for you.
First of all, I'm still on the way. We are still in a long journey. The journey is to complete the film. The journey is to gain recognition, formal recognition for this community. Just on December 20th, we put up the first formal request for recognition to the Israeli Prime Minister, President, Ministry of Diaspora, Ministry of Aliyah and Klita, World Jewish Congress, and chairperson of the Jewish Agency.
That's it?
That's it. Now, it is already 3 weeks. No one of them responded. We are waiting a bit more, and then we are going to approach them for the second time. And if they will not respond, we will have to move to the next stage. If they will respond with interest, we will come and meet them and tell them the whole story and circumstances, because it is time for them to take responsibility.
Right. 100%. And I think the fact that you have, you're not gonna stop. You're on the path. You're gonna reach the goal, and kol hakavod to you to have the bravery to take on the big policymakers. But I've studied myself a lot of history. People were talking about the lost tribes in the 1800s during Columbus's time. This is something that people have shown an interest in. Why is it so important now that the Jewish people have to recognize that there is something to pre-Talmudic Judaism coming from the lost tribes of Jacob?
First of all, it's a very complex issue, but to say it very simply, normative Judaism is based on halakha. But halakha is relatively a modern development. There was Judaism before, the Judaism that was practiced in the first temple. Where are all these people, Israelites, that practiced Judaism in the first temple?
Tribe of Dan. The biblical tribe of Dan that was taken away in the year 721 BCE by the Assyrian king, taken, according to legends, to a place called, place beyond the mountains, to Bikat Hayarech, the Valley of the Moon. Where is this place? No one knows. He starts telling us this incredible story, how a group of Jewish anthropologists and sociologists have been, for the last 17 years, carefully studying an isolated tribe in the Gondar region, the existence of which has been known for decades, but never been thoroughly researched. And this group of individuals, they're living an archaic form of Jewish life that hasn't been seen for over 2,500 years. You would probably call it the Judaism of the First Temple period. In other words, anything that the Jews knew about in their communal saga, their collective saga, or that they performed as part of their tradition, then that's what this group does today. But anything that has been added to the Jewish repertoire since that time, any new leaders or new institutions or major events in Jewish history that transpired after their separation from mainstream Jewish life, they know nothing about. Absolutely nothing about, because they were physically isolated and had no way of knowing. So, for instance, they knew quite a lot about Jewish life even then. for they had 1,000 years of Jewish history behind them. They knew about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Pharaoh and dreams and Egypt and fat cows and skinny cows and pyramids and slavery and Moses and Red Sea and Dead Sea and Mount Sinai and 10 Commandments. And they knew about Joshua. They knew about Jericho. They knew about the prophets of Israel. They knew about the judges of Israel. They knew about the kings of Israel. They knew Saul, our first king, and they knew David, our second, and they knew Solomon the third, and they knew that Solomon was the one who on Mount Moriah had constructed some 2,900 years ago the first temple. They didn't call it the first temple because they didn't know there had been a second. They called it Solomon's temple. And there were a few other minor things that they never heard about. They knew almost nothing about synagogues because they knew about the temple in Jerusalem. And they knew nothing about rabbis because they knew about the Kohanim, the priests that served in the temple. And they knew very little about prayer because they were very much into sacrifice. They knew about the sacrifice at the time of the first temple. They knew nothing about Tzfat and Jewish mysticism and nothing about the expulsion of Spanish Jewry in 1492. They knew nothing about King Herod and the Second Temple. They knew nothing about Herzl or about Zionism or about Hitler or about the Holocaust, and they've never heard of the State of Israel. As a matter of fact, they didn't even know there was such a thing as Jews with white skin. They are the only Jews that are left. They are the remnants of Beta Israel, the house of Israel, that was dispersed 2,700 years ago. They didn't even know there was such a thing as Jews with white skin. They didn't even know there was such a thing as Jews with white skin. They didn't even know there was such a thing as Jews with white skin. They didn't even know there was such a thing as Jews with white skin. They are the only Jews that are left. They are the remnants of Beta Israel, the house of Israel, that was dispersed 2,700 years ago. God, we had to bring underwear to Shmulik's house on Saturday night to get a Bible lesson about the tribes of Israel from 2,700 years ago. He's gone on one too many missions. He's lost touch with reality. And then he says, we've discovered the tribe of Dan. And then he says, we've discovered the tribe of Dan. And then he says, we've discovered the tribe of Dan.
All right, so you just heard us say that there was Judaism, or what we call it, some people call it Yahwehism, before the Second Temple period. We talked about the Second Temple period before. That's when they are coming back from Babylon. You know about Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel. You know, they real bit. But before that, that's what they're considered. You know, with King Solomon, David, all that. That's that First Temple period. So that's why we say we go back to the ancient ways, not just to the Second Temple period, and that's when they brought in a lot of different things. That's what we'll talk a little bit about that. But the First Temple,
God, and we need to be truthful. Now, I'll share with you something, and that is some time ago, I did a video with our friend Christian about the Kabbalah. And I'm sorry if this offends some, but that book, and I'm speaking primarily of the major book of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, is not of God. It does not teach something that is pleasing to God. If that's offensive, so be it. I am not called to say what is popular, what others are going to applaud me for if I say this or if I don't say this. It's not who I am. And therefore, we have to take a stand. We have to say that which is pleasing to God is truth. And if something is not of truth, now, of course, we find books, for example, books written about the Torah, for example, from believers. They're not all truth. Of course not. All truth only comes from God. And we see books written by rabbis that are not all truth. Again, all truth comes from God. But they're not demonic in nature. They're not perfect, they're not inspired, but there may be a lot of good things. But when we look at this mysticism and we see the foundation of what they want to teach, it is not of God. It is from what they would call Sad Acher. That is the other side. And we see such a rendering of that in the New Covenant when Yeshua says, I want to go to the other side. And when he gets to that area on the other side of the Galilee, who met him? That man that was possessed by 2,000 demons. So that other side represents demonic. Now, and this what is our objective, that people might know that there is a God. What God? The God of Israel. And only his word is truth. And I'll say this again, unapologetically. If we seek through other materials, things that are not of God, inspired by him, it is very dangerous. Now, for example, in the Talmud, do we find things that can help us understand the Word of God better? Yes. But overall, it's not of God. And there's a lot of things that if we rely upon the testimony of the Gemara, the Talmud, it's going to lead us away. I never want to be an influence leading people in the wrong way, but leading them to truth.
But the first temple period. So where are all these people, she's saying, that was part of that first temple period, right? So that's some of us, right? Like, some of the Ethiopian Jews, the Limba Jews, which they call them, the Limba, as you know, our elder who we beloved that passed, he always called himself African Israelites, right? So we have the Igbo, we have the Ewe, the God, the Gadangmi. God means Gad. Gadangmi means Gad and Dan. They're all in West Africa. Da means Dan. The tribes are called that now. So Ewe means Ewe or Hebrew. The real original word for Hebrew is Ewe. You got the Ewe people. They know that their name was originally Ewe. So you have so many people all throughout Africa that have understand their culture. Some of them are even waking up because they're not called Jews. So if you say Jew, they wouldn't know about the history of Jew. But Yadeans, or even like the capital of Cameroon, Yahudi. It's like you hear these Yah names all. There's a guy that goes through all these different places through Africa that connects it back to the Hebrew people. Not mean all Africans are Israelites, but it just shows you that there are some that are connected, and we are some of those who are connected to those who are connected to those that's coming from Israel, like the Ethiopian, the Beta Israel Jews. So she's talking about how it's hard for people to recognize that in modern day Judaism, right? And there's some people only will recognize it if you convert to the current modern day Judaism that she's talking about as well. So, but when it comes to the ancient Judaism, so they're going to even go into talking about the end times. So that's interesting. She's going to be throwing out scripture saying that these people that's waking up like us is part of the end times, and that's even from their belief system. So, it's important to understand the differences of this. So if you get caught up, like we talked about before, some people say you shouldn't convert. I was talking to an elder here just recently from Africa. I won't give the place, but he was just telling me, he's a Levite. He said he wouldn't, even though he's part of the Judaism or Jewish custom, he believes in some of those things. He still believes in the Messiah, but he said do not convert because he would lose his Levite status if he convert. He'll be just a regular, modern day type of Jew. So it's very important to understand these concepts and things. So, and you're hearing it from them. So this is not me saying this. So a lot of people try to put the black face on everything and demoralize it. So this is, she's a doctor of anthropology talking to Israeli news channel. So, if there's somebody you need to attack, don't attack me, attack what they're saying. All right?
We're Israelites. Judaism is also a modern concept. Now, because of many circumstances...
And Judaism comes from Judah, only one of the tribes.
Exactly. So all these communities have been spread out all over the world. They have been under pressures of Christianity and Islam. Many people have been lost under these pressures. Some have survived secretly, like my community in Ethiopia, like the Bnei Anusim in Brazil, like the Lemba in Zimbabwe, and more and more.
We came to Ethiopia because God dispersed the Beta Israel into the four cardinal directions. So we came down from Egypt. We came here following the shores of the Blue Nile. Others went to America, Germany, and many other countries. We came to Ethiopia because God dispersed the Beta Israel into the four cardinal directions. So we came down from Egypt. We came here following the shores of the Blue Nile. Others went to America, Germany, and many other countries. We came to Ethiopia because God dispersed the Beta Israel into the four cardinal directions. So we came down from Egypt. We came here following the shores of the Blue Nile. Others went to America, Germany, and many other countries.
And more and more. Now, in this time, I believe that the Geulah is coming.
Geulah meaning the Messiah.
The redemption, not the Messiah, the redemption on the prophets of Jeremiah, who speak specifically on the offsprings of Beta Israel that will return from all the places they have been dispersed. And second, at this visit, I got it very strongly. I saw in front of my eyes the prophet of Yechezkel, about the prophet on the dry bones. These elderly people who live in poverty, in remote places, holding to their identity in spite of all pressures, they are there. And now they are going to reveal themselves slowly again and again. And they need our support. They are part of us, we are part of them. We can't give up on them. They hold very origin form of Judaism.
They were actually abandoned and left with the monks on Tanakirkos. Okay, the monks have brought this bronze, very corroded bowl out. They call this a gomer. They say that they put blood in this during the blood sacrifices and that someone would stir it to keep the blood from coagulating. It was used in the blood sacrificial services. They tell me that this bowl came from Solomon's temple. That's true. This would be the only known implement from Solomon's temple to exist in the world today that can be verifiable.
The monks brought out a pair of ancient meat forks and said they came from Solomon's temple with the ark. The monks explained that these meat forks were used to put large pieces of meat on the fire in the burnt offering sacrifice. Each fork was topped with a budding almond symbol, one Bob had seen at other sites in Ethiopia.
And this stand is extremely old, very, very heavy. This gomer fits on the top of this stand like this. You can see it's bent from time and wear and just sheer fatigue. But they claim when they became Christian that they did not need these implements any longer because they were involving the blood sacrifice. So with Jesus Christ offering the blood of sacrifice, these were no longer needed in their ceremonies. So they were left with the monks. Where did they get them? They had virtually no metal on the island and no ability to manufacture these items, and plus the items were extremely old in antiquity. So where did these implements come from? Where did they get them? They had virtually no metal on the island and no ability to manufacture these items, and plus the items were extremely old in antiquity. So where did these implements come from? These monks said that I was the first one to be shown these implements, because if these ever proved to be articles that were from Solomon's temple, these photographs will be the only ones in existence to date.
The monks claimed that they possessed more than just the Ark of the Covenant. With the Ark came other implements for worship from Solomon's temple. The monks agreed to show these items and remove them from the temple treasury. This crown was said to be worn by the chief musician, one of 3 musicians who traveled in procession with the Ark.
And then these monks entered the temple treasury and they brought out these hammered silver trumpets, very long trumpets and very ancient trumpets. And we see that in Scripture that it says in Numbers 10, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, make 2 trumpets of hammered silver and use them for calling the community together and for having the camp set out.
These discoveries seem remarkable. But were these trumpets really relics from Old Testament times? Could they be identified as trumpets from Solomon's temple in ancient Israel? An important clue sits nearly 3,000 miles away in Rome, an arch dedicated to the Roman Emperor Titus. In this parade of victory, trumpets are seen, and they are clearly from ancient Israel.
When Titus sacked Jerusalem, he brought these trumpets back and paraded them through the streets of Rome. And a contemporary, an eyewitness that actually saw the trumpets, chiseled these trumpets on the archway in Rome at the Ark of Titus. And these trumpets seem to match perfectly with the trumpets that were brought from the treasury at St. Mary's of Zion. And these trumpets seem to match perfectly with the trumpets that were brought from the treasury at St. Mary's of Zion. And these trumpets seem to match perfectly with the trumpets that were brought from the treasury at St. Mary's of Zion. And these trumpets seem to match perfectly with the trumpets that were brought from the treasury at St. Mary's of Zion.
Form of Judaism.
And the key to fulfilling all of these prophecies that are happening during this time of being called by many the age of Aquarius, the time of the Mashiach, the Geulah, all of it, one being, which is Israel being a house of prayer for all nations.
Yes. And one more thing that I want to say, you know, there are Jews who make Aliyah and come and live in Israel. But there are more Jews who live outside of Israel. The Jewish diaspora is all over the world. And for us, it is the time to recognize, to understand that there is a large-scale Jewish diaspora in Ethiopia, in different places, in different situations. My community is the first to come out clearly, and now, after so many years, be connected to some people from Israel and some people from the Jewish world. But this is just the beginning. We are about to establish the Jewish Federation of Ethiopia in the next coming year.
All right, so you can see they talk about the original form of Judaism. That's what they're talking about, the first temple. So period as well, and saying that they have the more original form of Judaism. So that's interesting, because as we go through some of these videos, you'll start seeing how even in Israel that they're trying to tell them to convert. Even though they have the more original form, they're trying to tell them to convert to the modern day Judaism as well. So that's important to understand what is modern day Judaism, traditions and cultures, and what's the ancient, because we know, even as she said, Ezekiel, that's what she was talking about, the dry bones, but talks about how the bones will come back to life and they become back together as one, and, you know, saying that the people will arise. And then it says that the spirit, the ruach, will be placed within them. And, you know, that's, you know, him connecting back to us from a ruach. So it's one thing to understand your culture and your heritage. Is another thing to come from your heart, which we have talked about before. All right. So this next one is one that's talking about the Beta. I just call them Beta Israel because Flash is derogatory, but they, you know, you'll know the difference. I think they even talk about it. So how they actually were in Ethiopia. I think it talks about how they had to escape and go to Sudan. This is just part one. We'll watch part two, y'all willing, next Shabbat. But they were actually had to be airlifting. There's a project called Project Solomon. Can't remember the other one. I think it's Moses. One was Moses, one was Solomon. Where they basically focused on taking them, airlifting them out of the poverty that they were in and taking them to Israel to live. So there's also videos to talk about that transition. And then it also talks about, there's some that talks about what happened after that. So this is just the beginning, just to get you, you know, acclimated to what happened from a personal standpoint, because a lot of people don't talk about this portion of it. And this makes a big difference because, like I said, some of those people are, you know, connected to the same ancestors that we are connected to. All right, so thank you.
these villagers in the Simeon Mountains of the Gondar region of Ethiopia call themselves Beta Israel, the House of Israel. They are the black Jews of Ethiopia and trace their lineage to the earliest days of the Bible. When James Bruce, the 18th century Scottish explorer, encountered them for the first time, he wrote, "These are the ancient inhabitants of the mountains, who still preserve the manners and language of their ancestors. They are the only potters and masons of Abyssinia, and in this they excel greatly, and in general live better than the other Abyssinians, which in their revenge attribute to a skill in magic." To this day, the Ethiopian Jews are reputed by their superstitious neighbors to possess supernatural powers. In Ethiopia and much of Africa, smithing is associated with sorcery. The Falashas, as the chief practitioners of this craft, are viewed suspiciously by other Ethiopians, who fear the Falashas can cast an evil eye or Buddha upon them. After the Ethiopian Jews lost their independence in a series of wars in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were banned from owning land and branded Falasha, or outcasts. Since that time, the Ethiopian Jews have relied on their skills as metal workers, weavers, and potters for their economic survival. How the Falashas acquired their metallurgical expertise is not really known. Possibly they learned from Yemenite Jews who crossed the narrow straits of the Red Sea to trade and live in early Ethiopia. Living in isolation for centuries, the Falashas thought they were the only surviving Jews in the world.
To Ethiopia, my father told me he was not recognized by our Kesib. He was not allowed to enter to synagogue because he was white. So I myself, I thought all the Jewish people over the world are black people.
In the world, Jacques Beitlovich was among the first European Jews to work for the preservation of the Falashas. Deeply impressed with their devotion to Judaism, he wrote, "They adore a God of life, of righteousness and justice. Always in their thoughts, he inspires them with hope in a future of universal peace and harmony. In praying, they raise their souls to the infinite. They ask God to make Zion resplendent and to bring them back to Israel, their cherished country." The Keses are the Ethiopian Jewish holy men. They take the responsibility for preserving and transmitting the law and traditions of the people from generation to generation. When the famous Jewish scholar Halevi made his epic journey to Ethiopia in the 1860s, he was astounded to find that the Ethiopian Jews had maintained the Jewish lunar calendar precisely throughout the centuries, and that their religious observances coincided exactly with the religious holidays held by Jews around the world. In fact, he discovered an ancient Jewish people strictly observing the tenets of the Torah, the bedrock of the Jewish faith. The people prayed in Gaiz, an ancient...
So that was important. He just said that they kept the calendar from way, way back, right? So it's important to understand the Ethiopian or the Beta Israel Jews as well as the Limba or the Yemenites as well. So like they have some of the closest culture, at least, connected to the Bible, right? So when people are talking about feast days and calendars, and we got the Pharisee calendar, the Enoch calendar, the Zadok calendar, the Jubilee calendar. So, the question is, how close can we get to that culture? And they said that basically the ones that's today, because you got to kind of think about it as well. The Romans actually crucified Yahusha, right? So they would know what was based upon some of their timing and how he died. should fall in the same time of what was going on with Passover and how they kept those customs and stuff. So even though there was, the book of Enoch and a lot of those things were even around then, but yet they still held to one traditional way as a group of people. And even the Pharisees were there as well. So the Pharisees are today's, what they call Rabbinic Judaism. So that's the Orthodox Jew. It's the same. So, they were there. Some of the people there was at the time of when Yahushua was there, right? Because even our people were the ones that said to crucify him, right? So they know it should be around the same time. Now, when they got kicked out completely of Israelites, and then it went to different places, and then there was a form of Judaism where people can convert to, and a lot of those things. Then they were trying to figure out what the moon would be at the place in Israel, right? But you're outside, like here in North Carolina, it's usually night here when it's day in Israel. So of course we're not going to ever keep the Passover on the exact same day and the exact same time, because that means we will have to keep it during the time they keep it in Israel, which would be during our day, not during our night. So they were trying to guesstimate and figure out. That's the reason why some people that practice Judaism now might do 2 days, because they were trying to make sure they cover both days and stuff. But even as they returned back to the land, from my understanding, is that they held to the rabbinical customs and not to the ancient. So that's what the doctor, I think her name was Shaktai, she was talking about how they held older traditions than what the modern day Judaism does today. So if we want, it'd be interesting, if we had our own people to go and figure out what type of traditions do they have from, their standpoint. So that's what Mamleket Kohanim is trying to do. We're trying to connect to some of those groups to understand, their traditions and how it goes back to the Bible, so we can try to figure out a closer tradition. We might never can figure it out, but we can know, here in America, we got to be careful not just to read a whole bunch of books and think we know it all, but we got to actually talk to those people who actually lived a life that's closer, that's closer to what our ancestors did, to understand their culture and how it can compare back to who we are today. So just want to point that out.
Ancient Semitic language, now almost extinct, and today only used in religious services. In this rare film clip, the Kesses are leading the people in the observance of the Seged, a Jewish Ethiopian holiday that commemorates the works of Ezra, the scribe priest who read the law to the Jews after the end of the first exile. Ezra admonished the Jews to obey and understand the laws of Moses faithfully. Ethiopian Jews believe that angels accompany man into the hereafter. The angel of light records man's good deeds, the angel of darkness his bad ones. The Ethiopian Jews highly revere Moses and have developed their own remarkable liturgical work called The Death of Moses, which is read during funeral services. The greatest bond between God and man in Ethiopian Jewish thought is the Sabbath. Its observance is considered the delineation between good and evil, between heaven and hell. The Kesses themselves hold various opinions on just how and when Jews first came to Ethiopia. Central to the psyche of all Ethiopians is the Solomon and Sheba cycle. In the Bible, first in Kings and then in Chronicles, the account of Sheba's pilgrimage to Jerusalem unfolds. The Ethiopian version of the biblical story embellishes the narrative and asserts that Sheba, having heard of Solomon's great wisdom, is summoned to Jerusalem via the king's supernatural powers. Sheba came to Jerusalem bearing immense riches, 600 camels laden with gold, spices, and precious woods. Sheba opened her mind to Solomon and tested him with difficult questions. Solomon answered all her inquiries, and smitten by Sheba's beauty, he seduced the virgin queen with the use of a silver chalice. When Sheba departed for Ethiopia, Solomon presented her with a perfect pearl. Upon Sheba's arrival in Ethiopia, she gave birth to Menelik, son of Solomon, king of Israel, and Sheba, queen of Ethiopia. When Menelik came of age, he journeyed to Israel to seek out his father. Upon his arrival, he was warmly greeted by his father, the king. Ethiopian tradition states that Menelik was the favorite son of Solomon and was driven back to Ethiopia by his jealous half-brothers. When Menelik left for Ethiopia, Solomon presented him with a copy of the Ark of the Covenant. Menelik switched the original for a copy, and accompanied by an Israelite army and a contingent of priests, he established Judaism as the official religion of Ethiopia and modeled his rule upon Solomon's in Jerusalem. Another account of Ethiopian Jewry's genesis begins in the cataclysmic days of the prophet Jeremiah during the last years of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Jeremiah warned the people that they would be scattered like straws that passed in the desert if they did not renounce their ungodly ways. King Zedekiah ignored Jeremiah's warning to not resist the strength of Babylon. Jeremiah was placed in a pit and left to die at the king's order. Ironically, Jeremiah was saved by the king's Ethiopian retainer, Ebed-Melech. King Zedekiah mounted his ill-advised revolt against Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar himself led the Babylonian army that sacked Jerusalem and took the Jews into exile. The Bible tells us that all the nobles, blacksmiths, and metalworkers, 10,000 people in all, were led off from Jerusalem, and that only the poorest people were left behind. Further, the Babylonians despoiled the temple and killed the high priests, Sariah and Zephaniah. King Zedekiah was blinded and put in chains, and in that way Judah was deported from its land. And there, by the rivers of Babylon, the people wept when they remembered Zion. The Bible further speaks of the poor Jews that were left behind in Judah. Many of them fled to Egypt. It is thought that some of these Jews continued their journey far down the reaches of the Nile, where they came to the island of Elephantine, to a place called the City of Ivories. It is documented in the Elephantine papyri that the Jews...
So this is, remember we talked about this just a couple of weeks back, talking about Elephantine Island and some of the artifacts that they found.
Of Dynasty 25, he was the first ruler of Dynasty 26, and expelled them from Egypt. He left his Jewish mercenaries here as the garrison on the border fortress of Elephantine. And they stayed here year after year, generation after generation. Children grew up and followed their parents into, or followed their fathers into the military service, the mercenary service. They were here for 2.5 centuries, right down to 400 BC. Bad King Manasseh ruled for 55 years. And to the exiles here in Elephantine, it must have seemed that his reign was never ending, and that they would never get back to worship God in the temple in Jerusalem, the temple which Manasseh had defiled. And so they built their own temple here on Elephantine.
That they found that actually led to the Soninke people of West Africa that we also descend, some of us also descend from, the Mali Empire and the Mali Jews, as they call them. So this is important, you know, once again, you can see the same connection that they're making to that Elephantine Island where they actually had this pagan temple. And, you know, remember, we all got kicked out because we mixed what Yah said do with, you know, paganism. So our people were already influenced by paganism. So you will hear some of the stories or see some of the things that they do, even in West Africa, mixed with like the libations and circumcision, but yet they'll do something to some other god or goddess as well. And then you see it even in the Elephantine Island, the Papyra, they actually did the same thing, but they knew that they were Israelites. And actually they wrote letters to people of the Bible, named in the Bible, that they have proof that they were interacting with people back then. So it shows you even more evidence through archaeology and through DNA and through our history as well, how we connect to different tribes. It shows you again that we are connected to we are the Israelites. There's no, that's the reason why the woman was talking about the old customs, the old traditions and all the stuff like that. It just shows you, here's these Ethiopian, they said Jews because, some of them said they came from Solomon, right, and Queen Sheba. So I think that's Nebuchadnezzar. I think there's a book that they have that talks about that. And then some of them you hear, I think he's going to go in and talks about the ones that said they came from Dan. So, like I said, the tribe of Da, that's in West Africa and Liberia and Sierra Leone, I think area, they say they come from, they're the tribe of Dan. And I think they're also called Jacob, as in Jacob.
Pas prendre un mot comme ça dans le vide pour donner. Même les historiens comme Noël Loukou, qui sont les grands historiens ivoiriens, ils ont dit les Danites, leur langue, on dit dans au premier, ça veut dire ceux qui parlent la langue dedans. Mais la langue dedans, c'est l'hébreu. C'est l'hébreu. 90% des mots Danites en Côte d'Ivoire, c'est l'hébreu.
Alors, pour moi, la ressemblance, d'abord, c'est le fait de ces termes en hébreu. Ça, c'est les termes en hébreu qui me paraissaient tout à fait marquants, parce que dans un patois, on n'a pas l'habitude de mettre des termes hébreux, c'est-à-dire que c'est vraiment dans le langage usité.
J'ai commencé à comparer les mots. Voilà. Et en hébreu, on dit Bereshit, mais chez nous, on dit Brassi. Vous voyez, c'est presque les mêmes racines, les mêmes façons. Yahweh, on dit Yahweh. Donc, chez nous, Yahweh, c'est Yahweh. Adonai, Adodang. Alors, tout ça, j'ai commencé à étudier tout un panorama linguistique et avec l'hébreu ancien par rapport à notre langue. Je dis bien l'hébreu ancien parce que ça évolue. Alors, il y a plusieurs similitudes linguistiques comme ça, et il y a plusieurs similitudes culturelles. Et par exemple, les habits que nous portons avec cette bande, qui étaient les habits des Cohen. Et dans ma langue danite en Côte d'Ivoire, les Cohen, on les appelle les Cohen. C'est la même chose.
Les noms dents, là, c'est les dents de l'ouest de la Côte d'Ivoire qui ont conservé ces noms-là. Sinon, les dents, il y en a un peu partout. Moi, j'ai parcouru un peu quelques pays où il y a les dents.
Mais c'est nous qui
Mais c'est les dents de Mans, la région des montagnes, qui a conservé le nom dents.
On nous appelle dents, mais notre nom aussi c'est Yacouba.
C'est Yacouba.
Yacouba. On a deux noms. Yacouba.
Yacouba et dents.
D'après vous, qu'est-ce que ça signifie,
Yacouba, chez nous, ça, normalement, ba là, c'est la contraction de Banou, c'est-à-dire enfant. C'est les enfants de Yakou.
Yacouba, les enfants de Yakou.
Les enfants de Yakou. Yakou Banou.
Yacouba. C'est qui Yakou?
Bon, on ne sait pas.
Yacoub, c'est l'un de nos ancêtres.
C'est l'ancêtre de Yacouba, des dents.
Jacob. So it's important to understand some of these things as well. All right.
Developed a remarkable trading relationship with the land of Ethiopia. Using the Nile as a highway, war elephants, ivory, spices, and gold passed through Elephantine on the way north to Alexandria and the Mediterranean. The Elephantine Jews grew rich and powerful. They built the first temple outside of Jerusalem and formed a militia known as the Jewish Force, which was charged with protecting Egypt's southern frontier. Elephantine was also the sacred island of the Egyptian deity Canub, whose sacred beast was the ox. But when the Jews persisted in sacrificing these animals during their rituals, in revenge, the Egyptian priests, in league with the Persian commander of the city, destroyed the Jewish temple in 411 BC. After the decline of Elephantine, it is theorized that the Jewish community followed the well-known trade route down the Blue Nile. A Falasha spiritual leader said in the 1860s that, "We came after Jeremiah, we came by Sennar, and from there to Axum." In the 9th century, Eldad ha-Dani, the fabled Jewish traveler, reported a powerful Jewish nation existed in Africa. He said the kingdom had been founded by the tribe of Dan. The kingdom was reportedly surrounded by the mystical Sambachan River, which rolled sand and stone during the week, but was surrounded by fire during the Sabbath. More likely, it is thought that once in Ethiopia, the Elephantine Jews mingled with the Ethiopian Igao people, thus introducing Judaism into Ethiopia. The Ethiopians had been worshiping a multitude of pagan gods, and the introduction of Jewish monotheism made a tremendous impact on the country's religious life. The people became well acquainted with the Jewish Bible, which later became the model for the Ethiopian Royal Chronicles, the Glory of Kings. Thus, the Ethiopian Jews became a hybrid of the Elephantine Jews and the African Agao people. They retain the military aspect of the Elephantine Jews and are thought to have come into the service of Axum. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church succeeded in converting the Aksumite royal family to Christianity in the 4th century. Prometheus, a shipwrecked Greek, is credited with winning over the emperor to the church. The Ethiopian Church is remarkable in its devotion to the Jewish laws of the Bible. The strict observance of the dietary laws, the practice of circumcision, and the keeping of the Sabbath are examples of the Jewish traditions it maintains. Ethiopian history generally acknowledges that Ethiopia was a Jewish country before its conversion to Christianity. For centuries, its royal dynasty traced its bloodline directly to King Solomon and his son Menelik, who had brought the true Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia from Jerusalem. Ethiopia itself is mentioned several times in the Bible. Moses journeyed there when, as son of Pharaoh, he subdued the Ethiopians. And Ebed-melech the Ethiopian saved Jeremiah from the pit. In the 15th century, Abba Sega, the son of an Ethiopian emperor, converted to Judaism and proceeded to reform Falasha ritual and prayer. He also introduced the Christian practice of monasticism. Jewish monks became a fixture of Falasha life and retained great influence over the Falashas into the beginning of the 20th century. The most important of the Ethiopian emperors was Caleb, who in the 6th century AD conquered the Jewish king of Arabia, Abu Duwas. With this victory, the area now known as Yemen came under Ethiopian control. This enabled Axum to control the lucrative Red Sea trade to India and the Orient, and to accumulate vast wealth. Another spoil of victory were the Yemenite Jews, expert metal workers and arms makers, who were carried off to Ethiopia by the victorious Caleb. Some historians theorize that in these Yemenite Jewish prisoners are to be found the true origins of Ethiopian Jewry. Meanwhile, the Judaized Agao were appointed by the Ethiopian emperors to protect the western borders of Ethiopia. This region controlled the trade routes to Egypt and the gold-producing area of Gojam. Later, chafing under the Aksumite kings and gaining strength from their strategic position, the Falashas rose up under the rule of a beautiful Jewish queen named Judith. Encouraged by the
All right, so this is just part one. So hopefully that helps you to get a better understanding of what was going on during that time. We're going to go more into depth of how they were found and also how they were taken to Israel. How some of them was taken to Israel. I wouldn't say all of them, but you know in the Bible like Jeremiah, he was basically saying, don't go down to Egypt when they came to him. And they said, first they came to Jeremiah and said, we'll do whatever you say do. He said, you're not going to listen to him. He said, oh, yes, we will. And he told them, Yah told them not to go down to Egypt. They said, you're lying. We're going to Egypt anyway. So just shows you how hard-headed our people were. But you can also understand how our bloodline is getting connected to Egypt, like what they said, even to Elephantine Island. And then, because it wasn't called Egypt, there was Mizraim. But then also, that the Mizraim and the Cushites, right, they mixed, right? Because even like the kingdom of Cush sometimes ruled Egypt or Mizraim. And then, they were fighting back and forth also over the kingship. So you can see how Cush is actually what people say is Ethiopia, right? So Ethiopia, Cush, Abyssinia, you hear all that same name. It's all connected back to the Bible as well. So you just got to understand the differences of the name and what they're basically calling the people. But you can see how they migrated also down through the east side of Africa, all the way down to like, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, even Tanzania, South Africa. Some people say some of the people that's connected, some of the tribes down there are also connected to the Israelites because of that migration. I can't remember the name of the other people. But then from Egypt, even like all the other tribes west of Africa said they came from that standpoint. So you can see how some of our brothers and sisters say they think they're Egyptian because, a lot of the migration came through Egypt. And also they basically, intermarried with the Egyptians a lot. So, even when Joseph went down to Egypt with his brothers and all them, there was 12 brothers, right? Who did they marry? Right? Some of them married Canaanite women, some of them married Cushite, to a time where there are millions of them that left Egypt, during the time of Passover. So how did they interact they didn't just have their sister, right? They didn't believe in incest, that they really were, marrying within those people that was of that region. So, but yet the paternal line was still Israelites, right? So that's why it's important. Israel is just not like one of the original. It was just Ham, Shem, and Japheth that get off the boat, right, with Noah, those sons. So all those sons breeding with each other makes these other nations, and that's the reason why the Israelite nation was of Ham and Shem, right? Mostly Shem from paternally, but was mixed in a lot with Ham as well. As we know that Judah had a Canaanite wife, and then the Canaanite daughter-in-law Tamar, which he had his children by. So the line of Judah would have Canaanite and Shemite DNA as part of it, right? So that's the important piece to understand with our lineage and heritage and DNA, how some of that stuff will be also within us. So we can understand why people, get caught up in Egyptology and some of the things like that. But it also shows that, if you look at the pictures of some of the pharaohs, they're holding their enemies, and some of their enemies are black as well. So who are the enemies of the pharaoh? If all Africa comes from, Egypt, it shows you there was other nations there as well. All right. So the lesson for today. Next slide. And Shabbat Shalom, Miss Atkinson, Cousin Atkinson. Thank you for joining us as well. And so this is the different things that we'll be reviewing. Once again, we went over a lot of these different things. So we're still on the pagan holidays. I know last week we had Purim. So we wanted to make sure that we got back to talking about the pagan holidays, because sometimes people get caught up. They don't understand why is it wrong to do the pagan holidays versus Yah's given holidays, and this is a continuation of that. So we went through Valentine's Day, I think, before Purim, and now we're going to start going to some of the next ones based upon the different months that comes along. All right. So my wife's going to scroll down to that one that where we ended up from last time. And then, so remember, we talked about a lot of the things about Yah's warning and things, and how it's connected back to the blessings and curses, and how, you know, we were cursed because our people start following other Elohims, other gods, right? And we talked about how, you know, a lot of stuff that happened around Valentine's Day and how that's actually even connected to the devil. There we go. And now we're going to talk about some of the spring feasts, right? So remember, the Romans were the major power of Europe. And then they actually were interacting with the other Europeans, trying to dominate some of them, even like the Celts and other people, right? But all of them still had this form of paganism that ends up getting blended in together as the Romans going and dominate other people, the Roman Catholic Church, and they're trying to force people to convert to Catholicism, right? Christianity. So that's the reason why we'll see a mixing of some of the traditions and some of the beliefs together, some of the gods and goddesses, even with Egypt. Some of the same gods end up getting mixed in with some of the European beliefs as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. So this is the pagan and the witch calendar. Some people call it the witches calendar. Some people call it the Celt, the Druid calendar. But, you know, it basically pulls a lot of these things together. It's interesting that it has that sign of the Trinity in the middle. But, you know, so the spring starts with that one called Imbolc, I guess is how you say it, and it starts right there around February time frame, and that's when the spring begins, right? The equinox. So we just actually passed that day. Also, for a lot with our calendar, we basically know when the days are even. There's even days, and even time of daylight and nighttime. You know, darkness. That actually is the equilibrium, right? So that's when the equinox, equinox comes in. So this was during that time as well. So all these things are important, because just look at the right half. You see Imbolc, Ostera, Baltine, and Litha. I know all that is connected to female gods, right? So why are all this stuff connected to female gods and goddesses from February all the way into June? So remember, we talked about how June was Juno. It was a goddess of Rome, right? So you can see how a lot of these gods and goddesses, May is Maya, goddess as well. We'll get to that as well. She's a goddess. Why we call the month May. So a lot of these gods and goddesses are connected to one another also. All right. So the Imbolc, you see on the right side, it talks about it's a Gaelic traditional festival on February 1st. It marks the beginning of spring. And Christianity has a day that it basically mimics, called the feast day of Saint Brigid. So it says Imbolc falls about halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So in between those two. And is one of the 4 Gaelic seasonal festivals, along with Beltane, I can't even say these names, Lug Hassad, and Salmon. So you can see those days there, right? You can see, like, in the corners is basically when the seasons are changing, right? Within their calendar there. Then you go down to the next. It's talking about originally a pre-Christian or pagan festival associated with the lambing season, the coming of spring, and possibly the goddess Bridget. So remember that even the Christian festival that they had was let me see, what is it called? The pre-Christian physical. I'm trying to find it. I don't know where I left it. Oh, Saint Bridget, right? So they call that the feast day of Saint Bridget now. So why would they call that? Sounds very connected to their goddess, who was named Bridget as well. That was the pre-Christian era. So they used to have a doll they made for her, and it says, which was paraded around the community by girls, sometimes accompanied by straw boys. Bridget was said to visit one's home on St. Bridget's Eve to receive her blessings. So she used to come and visit them, right, to give them blessings. People would make a bed for Bridget, leave her food and drink, and set items of clothing outside for her to bless. Holy wells would be visited. A special meal would be had, and the day was traditionally linked with weather lore. All right. And it says it is still observed by some Christians as a religious holiday and by some non-Christians as a cultural one. And its customs have been revived in some places since the latter 20th century. Celtic neo-pagans, remember I told you about that neo-pagan word, about people who still celebrate that stuff even to this day, and Wiccans, witches, have observed the Embolic as a religious holiday. So we know that they still do this, right? So it's important to understand this, right? So understand how it's connected back to some of the pagan traditions. So go to the next slide, please. And then this is Bridget. So just want to make sure people understand Bridget, meaning exalted one. So she was exalted. That's her name, to exalt her. And she was the goddess of a pre-Christian Ireland, right? So that's important. We start talking about Ireland, where some of these things are basically being, traditions are being coming from. And says that, she had two sisters, Bridget the healer and Bridget the smith. This suggests she may have been a triple deity, like kind of like a trinity, right? So you can see that even that trinity sign that was actually within the witch's wheel. So that's interesting too. It says Saint Bridget shares many of the goddess's attributes in her feast day. First of February was originally a pagan festival called Embolic. It has been thus argued that the saint is a Christianization of the goddess, or that the lore of the goddess was transferred to her. So just interesting that we have some association to that, right? So the next one after that is, go to the next one, is Ostera. And that was in April 17. Click on that link. I don't know if it's going to pop up. We'll see. But people still worship her now. That's why I try to tell you about neo-paganism, that these things are still going around. They're still worshiping these false gods and goddesses. And it's important for us to also know that, because we know how is our worship connected to this, right? So it says 14 austere rituals to celebrate the spring equinox. That's where we are now, right? So she's connected. You can see the little statues. So this is stuff people are doing now. This is not ancient stuff. But if you just scroll down and see the big numbers, so you see the big, like, keep on going down. So it's that's 2. Like number 1 was at the top. 1 was decorate eggs. That's how they celebrate her. The decorating. That's the wheel of the year guy. You can see that witch's wheel on the right side. Same calendar and stuff as well. And you can see they say decorate eggs. Go down number 2. Plant seeds. Spend time in nature. Got black people associated to decorate your altar for Ostera. They're still worshiping her. You can see those are, if you scroll back up, so that little picture that was there, yeah, right there. You see Wheel of the Year. You can see Yule, some Hanan, some of the same. They have a Sabbath. For those that's in the Bible study, remember we talked about there was other people that had Sabbaths that was being honored during the book of Colossians, and they were fighting Gnosticism. Paul was going against Gnosticism as well. So you can see how some of those traditions are still connected. They still call their day Sabbaths or Shabbats, just like we call our day Shabbats. Okay, please keep going down. And you can see make crafts, just, drink dandelion tea. I know about dandelion tea. I didn't know that was part of their traditions. But cook with early spring produce and eggs. So it goes back to that connection to eggs, honey, lemon, sprouted greens, spring greens, asparagus, violets, lavender, and mint. All right. So go down, host an Astor feast or spring tea party, spring clean, right? Spring cleaning, people know about some of that. Go on a hike as a moving meditation, observe the sunrise or the sunset, make a floral cocktail or mocktail. I don't know what a mocktail is. You can tell I never drunk before. Do an Astor tarot reading, card reading. Interesting. All right. I think, let me see, is that around the end? All right, balancing spell or meditation. Okay, so you can see that they still do rituals to this day for Ostera. So I just want to make sure people know that this is not just something of the past. It's still something that people still do now. So who is Ostera? So we go to the next, and we know she was also called Eoster. I think that's how you say it. and she was, named in Old English. You can see there is Easter, 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 Eastre, however you say that. And different people, Old German with Ostara. So you say she got different names: Ostara, Estora, Eoster, however you say these names. And then it says she is the namesake of the festival of Easter. In some languages, the Old English deity Estora is attested solely by Bede, we'll get to him later, in his 8th century work, The Reckoning of Time, where Bede states that during, I don't know how to say that, the equivalent of April, pagan Anglo-Saxons had held a feast in Estora's honor, but that this tradition had died out by his time, replaced by the Christian Paschal month, a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. All right. So you can see now that they basically said that they were doing stuff for her, and then something died out, and they start doing this celebration, at least during that time of the Roman Catholic Church. All right. So then at the end, it says theories connecting Esther with records of German Easter customs, including hares and eggs, have been proposed. So, what does a rabbit, bunny laying eggs, what does that have to do with anything about the Bible? Right? So we know something's up with that, right? Estor and Estor are sometimes referenced in modern popular culture and are venerated in some forms of Germanic neo-paganism. So they, like we said, they still are keeping some of the customs even unto this day. All right, so next. So remember the scripture we talked about, and it says 6 days you are to, this is Exodus 23. So this is the Israelites as they were going out of Egypt. It says 6 days you are to do work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from labor, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the sons of your female slaves, as well as your strangers, may refresh themselves. Now concerning everything which I have said to you, be on your guard, right? And do not mention the name of other gods or Elohims, nor let them be heard from your mouth. So, why do we go, what some people go, I mean, even I used to, go to church, right, and starts bearing this false goddess name before who they say is the God of the Bible, or Yah. So you go before Yah and you're saying Easter, you're reverencing her name right in front of them. Just like as we read about how they were pulling stuff into the temple and Josiah had to get that stuff out. It's very interesting that we're still pulling in these things that Yah say he's a jealous Elohim, He's a jealous God. So it's like we're doing this right in front of his face, which is like, whoa, we got to be careful of what we do. And we see in 2 Kings, so in 2 Kings, the northern tribe, the 10 tribes, were kicked out of the north of Israel, right? They had the northern tribes, you had the southern tribes, right? Northern tribe was 10, the southern tribe was just 2, and some of the Levites. So you just had the southern tribe, you had Benjamin and Judah, and all the other ones were part of the northern tribe, right? So the northern tribe were worshiping these false gods and doing stuff, and Yah got mad and he kicked them all out. And that's what started what they call now the lost tribes of Israel, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But he replaced those people in Samaria and other places with these other nations of people. So, from these, but it says in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 29, but every nation still made gods of its own. Because what happened is when he put these other nations in the place of the northern tribes, that, they were worshiping, like they usually worship in their false god or false pagan ways. And then the lions start eating them and start attacking them because y'all like, this is my land. So even though I kicked out my people, you still got to reverence it, right? So he ended up, the king of, I think, which one was the northern tribe was taken by? Assyrians, went and got one of the priests, the Levite priests, and brought them to the land. So that priest taught the people how to keep the Israelite customs so they'll stop being attacked by lions, right? But even after he taught them, they still start doing their own customs along with serving Yah at the same time. So that's what they call syncretism. They're mixing religions, and just like the Romans did, the Romans went and they mixed in religions of their own, European paganism, along with the Bible. So that's the reason why, like I said, they were going around conquering different nations, even in Europe, and they start mixing their, saying, hey, you don't have to stop doing your customs, just give it Bible names, call it a saint, call it this, holy day, do it on, this day on Passover or something like that, right? Mix those two beliefs together. And you can see in verse 32, it says, they also feared Yahuwah and appointed from themselves priests of the high places. So now they're appointing their own priests, because remember, only the Levites from the tribe of Levi, who are descendants of Aaron, were supposed to be the priest. But now they're making their own priests, right? So that's interesting. So you know about the Samaritans of the Bible. When the woman was at the well, she told Yahusha, she said, my people pray over in the hills, and yours pray at the temple. And Yahusha said, there'll come a time where people won't worship at either place, but worship him in spirit and in truth, right? So you can see how, that conversation was going on and why that conversation was right. During that time, because they had replaced the northern tribe with other people, the Samaritans. So, and it says, who acted for them in the house of the high places, verse 33, they feared Yahuwah and served their own gods according to the customs of the nations from among whom they had been carried away in the exile, showing that they still, even though those other nations was coming to the northern tribe, the Samaria and the Israel, that they still carried their gods, but they were mixing in with, worshiping of Yahuwah. It says, verse 34, to this day they do according to their earlier customs. They do not fear Yahuwah, nor do they follow the statutes or the ordinance or the law or the commandments which Yahuwah commanded the sons of Jacob. So he's showing you that distinction, that they're coming into the land. He told them, look, just, you're living in the land, just follow me and honor me. And they said, we will, to some extent, even though we're not the original people. But now they're even pulling in their gods, the high places. You hear them talk about a lot, where they were worshiping other gods of the northern tribe, that they were doing the same thing, but they were mixing it in with Yah. So they basically did the same thing that the Israelites who left, they were basically doing the same thing, by following different gods, their gods, along with Yahuwah. All right. And then it says, let me see, verse 35, with whom Yahuwah made a covenant and commanded them, saying, you shall not fear other gods, nor bow down yourselves to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. But Yahuwah, who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and with an outstretched arm, him you shall fear, and to him you shall bow yourselves down, and to him you shall sacrifice. The statutes and ordinance of the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall observe to do forever, and you shall not fear other Elohims. The covenant that I have made with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other Elohims. But Yahuwah, your El, you shall fear, and he will deliver you from the hand of your enemies. However, they did not listen, but they did according to their earlier custom. So he's basically talking about how the reason why he kicked out the northern tribes, because they didn't do right. And now these replacement people are coming in. And so in verse 41 says, so while these nations feared Yahuwah, they also served their idols, their children likewise, and their grandchildren, as their fathers did, so they do to this day. So it shows you that tradition was passed from generation to generation, just like Easter is today, right? Like Easter eggs, people don't know why they're doing the Easter eggs. They have no clue where that comes from, right? Easter ham, people don't have a clue what that is all about, but we do it just because of the generations before us told us to do it. And you can see now that's exactly what got the northern tribe kicked out of Israel once they start mixing in other religions along with Yah, and they were kicked out, and then other people came from other nations and they did the same thing. So it just shows you, what Yah is doing, because if you start knowing about prophecy, it gets even more interesting, but we won't go there today. All right, so next. So how was Yahusha's, or people call him Jesus, life, death, and resurrection changed from being celebrated at Passover to Easter. There's definitely a big difference on how they celebrate Passover, and that's actually in Ethiopia. You see the women there making the flatbread, the unleavened bread, but now they're making cakes with leaven, right? Easter is cakes with leaven. They're making unleavened bread. Why are they picking eggs and Easter bunny and doing all that kind of stuff, right? So there was a big shift around 325 AD because, Christians came in from the Roman Christians came in early. You can see even in the Bible where Cornelius is coming from the Gentile world and he's basically being baptized, right? So it's a lot of the Gentiles are now converting and becoming, under what they call God-fearers or Yah-fearers, right? They feared the word because they heard it, but they didn't understand it. So they were supposed to still going through the customs until they basically go to the Shabbat and learn about the customs until they totally get an understanding, right? But their heart was right. But then there was a mixture of we just talked about Gnosticism, where it was very similar, and people start going in a different direction of mixing other practices. So in Revelations, he talks about the Nicolaitans, right? Talking about, how they were trying to, how people were going in the way of the Nicolaitans, and Yahushua himself talked about how, that would be their destruction, right? So you can see how a lot of that stuff happened early on, way before 325 AD. But when Constantine came, he basically put a stamp on it. He sealed the deal. He said, okay, we're going to do this going forward, even though Christianity and beliefs had already been improved by other emperors, but he's the one that put a stamp and said, this is what we're going to do going forward, right? He tried to get his kingdom to come together because they were split between paganism and, their form of Christianity. All right, so next. So here, this is the book. Oh, I had it beside me. I guess I took it in my office. But here you can see in the Bible charts, maps, and this is a Baptist book that I used to use when I was a Baptist minister or non-denominational minister. And you can see on the right side, it talks about in 196 AD, there was an Easter controversy concerning the day to celebrate Christ's resurrection. The Western Christians preferred Sunday. Eastern Christians prefer linking Easter with the Jewish Passover, regardless of the day of the week. So as we celebrate Passover, we celebrate like the Bible does. The Bible, you don't know, is based upon when the moon comes, the crescent, and then 14 days, the 14th day of that month or that cycle, right? Like we talked about at the very beginning. Weeks ago. So it might be on a Tuesday, it might be on Wednesday, it could be on any day. But this thing about the certain time after the equinox, and that was the way that the Western Christians or the Roman Catholic Church that they celebrate. They were trying to change it, right? So they end up changing the time later on. Like I said, Constantine in 325 AD, he put a seal on. He said, okay, this is what we're going to do. But it was already debated way back in 196. And even the word Easter wasn't even around during that time. That goddess, she was called other things. But, you can see in the Baptist book, they talk about there was a controversy of when they want to keep it. Do they want to keep it based upon, the pagan traditions or based upon the biblical traditions? And you can see in the middle, this is not in the book, but in the middle, it talks about Astera, right? And she was, her turn, the myth is that's right, that she basically had this bird, and the bird basically got caught in the ice as his wings got cold, so she ended up turning that bird into a hare, so like a rabbit, right? And so rabbits don't lay eggs. I tell people that, right? That's should be common knowledge that rabbits give live birth. But we got this Peter Cottontail and stuff, letting go of eggs, and especially he's a male. Like, why is a male bunny laying eggs? But, we should see something strange that's going on with a lot of those stories around Easter. But it says that the goddess Astera turned the little bird into a rabbit, but gave the rabbit the ability to lay colorful eggs once a year on her feast day, right? So she had a feast day, Astera did, right? But later on, she gets mad with the rabbit, and she knocks him into the space, and it becomes a constellation. So you can see the constellation is still even there as well, and that comes from a witchcraft site that I found a long time ago. So this is a practice of witchcraft. Goes back to that pagan wheel of honoring Astera, which they're still doing to this day. All right, next. And we also know that the Bible doesn't line up a lot with what we used to do, some of us, or currently do, maybe some of you that's just coming over, trying to understand, which I'm thankful that you are doing so, but it doesn't line up with the biblical Passover. So we know that Yahusha said, he said, in Matthew 12:40, he said, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So how do you start Good Friday, right, and end up getting to a Easter Sunday when that's not 3 days and 3 nights? There's no way that's 3 days and 3 nights, right? You can try to make. I've heard even in seminary and heard other ministers say, "Oh no, the Hebrew day is only a half a day, or it's just a day during the time when it's light outside." They'll try to say that, but that should apply to every other scripture then. So when Yahushua was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, right? I guess he wasn't really in the wilderness 40 days and 40 nights. He was 20 days, 20 nights, right? You know, when it talks about the ark and stuff, you know, Noah's ark was out there in the water and it rested. I guess it really wasn't. It was only half that time. You have to use the same measurement no matter what time that you're using, right? And it just throws everything off if you try to do that. So to me, that's just terrible for them to do that. And it also says that, you know, because remember that he was buried right before the sunset, right? So he had to hurry up to, you know, the guy was it Joseph? He had to go in and hurry up and get the body from Herod and from Pilate, and he wrapped it and he put him in his own tomb. But he had to hurry up and do it. So because it was becoming night. And remember, they also had him on the cross, all with the thieves, Yahusha, and they had to go ahead and break their legs in order for them to go ahead and die because they were going to suffocate. You know, you break their legs, they have nothing else, and it was just going to suffocate and kill them. But they got to Yahusha, and he had already passed. So they didn't break his legs to meet the prophecy that not one bone would be broken in his body, right? So they end up taking him and put him in that tomb. So if you just count the days, so that would be that night. Then there would be a day. That'd be the first day, the night, the day, the second day, the night, the day, the third day, and then he was supposed to be resurrected. So in the Hebrew thought, if we look at the very top line, the as we talked about before weeks ago, is that the Hebrew day starts with evening, not with midnight as we do here. So I tried to overlap so you can see how that works, right? So just because we call midnight a new day, they wouldn't call the new day. Well, our ancestors say the new day happens when it's evening, right? Not at midnight. So even with that, if you look at it, the Hebrew concept, he was risen on Saturday night, which would be a new day, be the first day of the week, which would be Saturday night, not Sunday. But we know in the story, it talks about how Mary came when it was yet dark, and she saw the stone that was taken away, showing that he had already risen. So we got to understand these concepts and why it's important to understand our calendar and feast days based upon the Hebrew standpoint, and not try to take everything from the Bible and try to make it in a modern day understanding of days and times and seasons, but based upon what the Hebrews did, because that's where the prophecy ends up lying. It has to be in line with the prophecies of what was going on in their days, times, and seasons as well. All right, so next. All right, so this is going to be a little video. I think my wife already has it pulled up. So this man, he is called Richard Rivas, and you can start pulling up. He created this video called Too Long in the Sun, and I bought his book when I was trying to understand what all this stuff meant about Christianity and all this traditions and all this stuff I hear. And he's a Euro-American, right? So he's Caucasian. So people try to say this is a black thing. It's not, because he has a museum he's over, and the guy who had the museum actually found the Red Sea crossing. He found Sodom and Gomorrah, all these archaeology sites. And now he's still pushing those same, traditions. He has a museum in Tennessee. I wanted to visit it, but I couldn't because COVID happened. I haven't been able to get the time again. But he has a museum there, and he says that he's also for the law, in the commandments of Yah. And he says, about a lot of this Roman Catholic traditions that he found when he studied himself. He did the same thing I did, Well, I should say he's older than me, so I did what he did. I basically researched. I'm like, just looking through encyclopedias and stuff. So he's going to talk about, when he talks about that venerable bead and how that Easter controversy, actually happened, how even in Europe, they basically start, it's a documented time when he shows, when they converted the Passover into Easter. So that's what he's going to show. You should play that real quick.
Venerable Bede was an Anglo-Saxon theologian who lived in the late 7th and early 8th century. He devoted himself to the study of Scripture at a very young age, learning Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. The writings of Bede provide important information as to the traditions of Easter in the Anglo-Saxon Church. In 664 AD, the Synod of Whitby was held in the Kingdom of Northumbria. The principal discussion of the Synod was centered around the question as to the timing of the celebration of Easter. Should it be reckoned according to Scripture or by Roman tradition? The decision of the Synod was in favor of Rome, which brought England more in line with the Roman Church in Europe. Bede attempted to defend from a theological standpoint the decision of the Synod to replace the Celtic reckoning with that of the Romans. He tells us that the heathen Anglo-Saxons called the 4th month Easter month, after their goddess Eostre. Bede says that Easter was one of the most important spring festivals among pre-Christian Germanic people, and that it was dedicated to the goddess Ostara, or Eostre, whose name suggests east, and thus dawn and morning light. Bede records that the name of the festival was transferred to the celebration of Christ's resurrection when Anglo-Saxon and German heathens converted to Christianity. Scripture warns that the name of pagan gods are not even to be spoken. Theologians know that, yet each year in contemporary Christian churches around the world, the name of a pagan fertility goddess is proclaimed with honor. For over 1,500 years, Bibles written in many different languages referred to Passover and not Easter. That includes the very first English Bible, handwritten in 1385 by John Wycliffe. Yeshua, the Messiah of Israel, Jesus Christ, which the Bible describes as the Lamb which was slain, was crucified at the time of Passover, a feast of the Lord, Yahweh, far removed from the pagan festival of Easter. Earnestly contending for the faith once delivered to the saints, I'm Richard Reeves with Just the Facts.
All right, so you can see he talks about it as well. So I just like, sometimes people believe more when it's not, a black male saying stuff. So you can hear a white male saying it here, saying the same things, and he has more credentials and stuff than me. He still believes in the Bible. He's not against the Bible. He has a book there, Time is the Alley of Deceit. He goes through a lot of that history. We go to his YouTube page. He talks even more about some of the traditions of Easter and other holidays as well, just like I'm doing now, more detailed than I could probably provide as well. So, sometimes people just like to tune out because they, see certain people. But here, what is the difference here with this guy? And he was doing it back in the 90s or 80s as well. So, all right. So next. So like hot cross buns. Right? Isn't that interesting? Where does hot cross buns come from? So this is the website I went to that sells, bakery goods. I believe this is a bakery goods site. Baked goods. And, it talks about at the very bottom there on the left side underneath, it says a little sweet, a lot of spice, and all things nice. Hot cross buns have long been a staple of Easter time. But why are the hot cross buns eaten over Easter? And where do they come from? Let's take a delicious journey through time and explore the history of hot cross buns. So it starts off talk about the pagan origins. The origins of hot cross buns are shrouded in mystery, but historians believe they date back to the pagan tradition of ancient Britain. The sackings used to make to bake buns marked with a cross during the spring celebration to honor Diaspora. So Easter, the goddess of dawn and fertility. The cross symbolized the 4 quarters of the moon and a nod to the natural cycles of the season. So like I was telling you about the 4 corners of that witch's wheel, it's likely Easter is the origin of the word, or Estor is the origin of the word Easter. Christians' adoption. As Christianity spread through England, the church adapted many pagan customs. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So they're kind of mocking, saying that the Christians basically pulled in a lot of pagan traditions. But by the 12th centuries, these springtime buns were given a religious interpretation. The cross representing the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In the 14th century, Father Thomas Rockcliffe started distributing such buns to the poor in St. Albans, a town in Hertfordshire, England, on Good Friday. This cemented the association of hot cross buns with Easter and the end of Lent. The buns were typically made with the ingredients that were forbidden during Lent, such as sugar and butter, making them a special treat for the end of the fasting period. All right, so you can see there some issues there. So go to the next one. Okay. Here you can see where it talks about the Queen of Heaven. So once again, Yah in the Bible is talking against a female false goddess. Interesting, right? So in Jeremiah 7:18, it says, the children gather wood, and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And they pour out drink offerings to other gods in order to spite me. So y'all saying, hey, they're doing this to mock me, to attack me, right? Talking about how the children are involved, the fathers and the women, the family, the full family is involved into these traditions. So Jeremiah 44:17, it says, but rather we will certainly carry out every word that has proceeded from our mouths by burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, just as we ourselves, our forefathers, our kings, our princes did in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. So he's basically saying that, even our ancestors were mocking Yah in Israel, right? Right? So we can see why we're so messed up now, right? And for then we had plenty of food and we were well off and saw no misfortune. But since we stopped burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we lack everything and have met our end by the sword and famine. And said the women, when we were burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and we were pouring out drink offerings to her, was it without our husbands? Like, our husbands were right there. They were okay with us doing it. They didn't stop us. Right? Showing why we need, even like the husband being the head of the house. Sometimes you're going to have to try to direct the family in the right way. Sometimes it's the woman doing it, but the role was for the man to do it, right? And most time in the East, the man ain't even involved. He's just, giving money. The women running around getting the hair and, all the dresses and Easter bunny baskets and all that stuff for the kids. So you can see how some of those same things, because the man was even in the household, while we still even have, and then when he is, sometimes he's docile, right? Like, he just lets anything happen. Even though when Yah called forth Adam, he made Adam accountable for what happened, even though Eve was the one that, ended up being tempted by the fruit. So it says, was it without our husband that we were made for her sacrificial cakes in her image and poured out drink offerings to her? I was interested to understand what the drink offering is, if it's not libations. But then later on in Jeremiah 44 and verse 24, it says, then Jeremiah said to all the people, including all the women, hear the word of Yahuwah, all Judea who were in the land of Egypt. So going back, talking about when they left and went to that like Elephantine and all those different regions, how they actually left and went to Egypt. Thus says the Lord Yahuwah of hosts, El of Israel, as follows, as for you and your wives, talking about the family, you have spoken with your mouths and fulfilled it with your hands, saying, we will certainly perform our vows that we have vowed to burn sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven. That's going to be very important. Even in Catholic doctrine, they have a Queen of Heaven. So talking about even modern day. So, and pour out drink offerings to her. Go ahead and confirm your vows and certainly perform your vows. He said, okay, do what you want to do. You know, that's what I'm saying now. People going to do what they want to do. I used to try to tell people, and even the news, local news talked about how Easter was pagan. I'm like, people, it don't matter what you say. People going to still want to do what customs are. And that shows you how our people, even in Israel, were doing the same thing, and they were cast out, right, through the Deuteronomy 28 curses. And we're still going through the same thing now because we're not honoring. I'm like, that's why I always say Europeans, if they want to do the European stuff, that's one thing. But why are we doing it when that actually was associated to us in America through slavery, right? We did have some European people up there in, like Spain and Portugal, but they were Jews. They were black Jews, black Portuguese, right? So they weren't doing these things, or they were at least weren't, or they might have been getting assimilated in it. But one of the reasons they were kicked out because they continued to held on to their customs, and they were the people who were called Negroes, right? So Negroes is a Spanish word. It's not a British English word. It's a Spanish word. So we know that we're connected to that as well. So he said, go ahead and do what you want to do. So that's why I stopped just trying to push people. I'm like, man, that's pagan. We don't need to do that. And people are going to do what they already involved in frats and sororities and masons and all other kind of stuff, watching terrible videos. You can't convince people to change until their heart is ready, right? So it says 26, nevertheless, hear the word of Yahuwah, all Judah who are living in the land of Egypt. Behold, I have sworn by my great name, says Yahuwah. Never shall my name be invoked again by the mouth of any man of Judah in the land of Egypt, saying, as Yahuwah lives, behold, I am watching over them for harm. He said, now, I was trying to protect you, but now you're going to do this in my face? Oh, yeah, I'll be watching over you for harm. I'm like, I'm going to want bad. He wants bad stuff to happen to him then, and not for good. And all the men of Judah who are in the land of Egypt will meet their end by sword and famine until they are completely gone. So that is also part of Deuteronomy 28, that will be removed from the world until we actually repent and turn back to him as a nation. All right. So next, you can see that I'm going to summarize this. This is the worship of Tammuz and Ishtar. I don't know why I'm not saying that right. Tammuz or Tammuz. I don't know why I'm going through that. Maybe because I'm just going so fast. But the Easter story comes from the Sumerian legend of Damuzi or Tammuz, and his wife Inanna or Ishtar, right? And it's found in this book, so this is not just something that was just pulled out, but it's basically talking about that Tammuz dies, and his grieving wife Ishtar goes and follows him to the underworld to try to bring him back, and basically naked and bowed low, she is judged, killed, and then hung on display. In her absence, the earth loses fertility, so it goes back to that time of summer and winter, switching back and forth, just like Ostara. She's a sign of the equinox and it's coming in spring, right? So in Enki, so that was their god, created two creatures who carried the plant of life and water down to the underworld, sprinkling them on Inanna or Ishtar and Tammuz or Damuzi, resurrecting them, right? So it's a resurrection belief too, right, that they're actually doing, giving them the power to return to the earth as the light of the sun worship for 6 months, right? So so this whole thing of Tammuz now returns, and Ishtar is trying to pursue him. So that's the reason why they're saying we have the different seasons between winter being death and spring meaning life. So that was what it's supposed to be. But then at the end it says the resurrection of Egyptian Horus, the story of Mithras. So like I say, the deltas, the sorority deltas. No, I'm sorry. I'm thinking about Minerva. But Mithra is also connected to Mazda. So like Mazda's, the car company, that connects back to that. Mazda 666, who was worshipped at springtime, and the tale of Dionysus. Dionysus, that's what I was talking about during the time of Hanukkah. Dionysus is the connected also to the women that used to worship her and worship him. And he always said, remember the ivy, like in AKA, he was the god of ivy. Resurrected by his grandmother. So all these kind of stories are connected by the conception of renewal, descent into darkness, and the triumphs over world. So that spring, that winter spring kind of connection. That's what it's talking about, that circular connection. So these are the different gods on the left. So they just, given different name. Ashtoreth is the Sionians. The star was during the Phoenicians. Ishtar, Babylonians. Aphrodite's Venus is Rome, and I think that's Greece as well. Estar is the Celts. So it's just the same goddess going through different nations and societies, all the way until you get Estar equals Easter. So there's no debate that Easter connects to this paganism, to Ishtar, to the sun god, the moon goddess. All that is all connected. All right. So next, and it's important to understand that because this is the Christian site, Got Questions. You can go to gotquestions.com and just type in who is Astra, right? So remember they had these Asherah poles and stuff that they were cutting down in the Bible, and it basically says the same thing. I won't go through all of it, but going down at the middle, it says, considered the moon goddess and the goddess of fertility, Asherah was often presented as a consort of Baal, the sun god. Asherah was also worshipped as the goddess of love and war. So I know there's some, is it Helen? I think of the Roman or Greek was the god love, the goddess of war, love and war. So there's that connection again. And then it says at the bottom, Asherah being exclusively the goddess of fertility. So this is supposed to be the eggs. The bunny is the sign of fertility, right? Whereas Asherah passed into a moon goddess, both Asherah and Ashereth seem to have been consorts of Baal. Why is this all important? Why am I bringing this out, right? So next. So Baal and Asherah, these are goddesses of the Bible, false goddesses of the Bible. These are named goddesses of the Bible that's connected to Tammuz, to Estar, to Easter. All of it is the same worship of these gods and goddesses, right? And it's important because on the right, you see the same guy for Richard Reeves. You can go to his site, YouTube. You can just type in these things. You'll see it. But, he talks about how the Baal worship was brought into the Roman Empire by that guy at the top, the Roman emperor called Elagabalus. You hear Baal, Elagabalus. Baal is the sun god. He actually had them to worship sun god, the Baal sun god there. And you can see at the bottom that his coin, Elagabalus, it says reverse of an Arius of Elagabalus with the, I don't know how to say that, Bethel transported in a quadric. I don't know what these words mean, but the inscription means Deo Sola, right? To the holy sun god. So they're bringing the sun god, Sol, and later on, Constantine, he actually worshiped Mithra, and then they get this god Sol Invictus, right? The sun, unconquerable, invincible sun, unconquerable sun. So that's when Constantine says, we're going to worship on Sunday, his day. Right? And his birthday is December 25th. So we haven't got down to that, but you can see how these gods are being brought in. And the Bible says many times how Israel abandoned the worship of Yahuwah to serve Baal and Ashtoreth. So this double deity of the sun god being the male and the moon goddess being Ashtoreth, the fertility god as well. So once again, it's like we're falling in the same thing that our forefathers did long ago that Yah basically rebuked. And you can see in those scriptures, I won't go through all of them, but you can see how the Israelites kept on serving them and Yah rebuking them. And then when they're ready to come back to him, they left those old gods alone and went back to the true worship of Yah. So that was one of the symbols. Like when they were ready to let, especially these two gods, and goddess alone, or cut down the Asherah poles. When they were doing that, that was the sign of they were returning back to Yah. So now we're doing Easter. To me, when we return back to him and serve his feast days and do the things that he's called us to do, that's that sign of true repentance. That's when he talks about your whole heart. So that's the reason why I read 2 Kings at the beginning. When Josiah, he basically cut down the Asherah poles. He did all this reform to get Israel to go back to do what? Honor the original Passover that Yah told us to do, not what was brought in through all these other influences of cultures and false goddess to Israel. So we're basically in the same state right now, and we wonder why we're going through all these problems and situations as a people. But until we return back to him full-hearted, just like Deuteronomy 30 talks about, we're going to have some problems. Just to let you know. All right. So next, this is in Ukraine. So they're still doing this, right? Pagan Easter in Ukraine, beginning of Easter celebration. I pulled this off of one of those picture sites. So beginning of Easter celebrated, priests pray to the god of sun. I don't know, Kortelesia Island, Ukraine. Proto-Slavic Easter celebration occurs in first Sunday after the spring equinox. So that's exactly when Easter is celebrated. Versus Passover being that 14th day after the crescent moon of that month, right? So in the sanctuary of the bronze altar of Karth, I don't know how to say that island, pagan worship to one god who has a lot of different forms. He dies as a young boy, just like we were talking about Tammuz, and born as a man, Yerolo, on Easter. So he's resurrected, just like the story of so you can see the similarity of the resurrection of Yahusha with the resurrection of their S-U-N God, right? And you see the priest there with the sun down, and you see the board there, and that's a graveyard they're in, because they're honoring the resurrection. So at the top, you can see them having bread with leaven. You can see at the bottom, they have cakes, right? And during the time of Passover, we're supposed to have unleavened bread, right? But they haven't eaten stuff with leaven in it. And the woman is sitting there with an idol she has there in the middle. They have Easter eggs painted, right? So this is not something I'm just making up. This is something they're still doing to this day. So, that goes back to that thing about how they were offering cakes to the Queen of Heaven, right? So they were provoking Yah to anger because they were worshiping, the Queen of Heaven, or, similar customs as Easter or Estora, right? To this day. All right, so next. And we can see very strange things because, it says in the story that Tammuz also was killed by a wild boar, right? So what some of the traditions say is that, some people actually mourn or weep for Tammuz for 40 days. Isn't Lent 40 days as well? Where does Lent is nowhere in the Bible. So I don't know why. I used to see just Catholics do it, but now I'm seeing Protestants do it, which just blows my mind. I'm like, when do they start doing Catholic traditions? So also the tradition was to kill the boar. That's why you eat an Easter ham, because you're basically getting revenge for Tammuz by getting revenge on that boar. You eating a ham, right? So we know in the Bible that swine is unclean. You're not supposed to eat pork based on the Bible. So why would that be a biblical tradition? Let's put it that way. That doesn't make sense, right? So you can see there's already some issues with you eating a pig, right? When Yah says, don't eat swine, right? So when we talk about, the women weeping for Tammuz, that's what's in Ezekiel, that the women were weeping for Tammuz. So, why are they weeping for Tammuz? Because of that resurrection period of him dying and coming back to life. So that 40 days of mourning. So, it's very interesting that they're weeping for the sun god that was supposed to be resurrected. And now we try to honor Easter during the same time, the story of Tammuz, when Ishtar and Tammuz were, during that spring equinox, was coming back and forth, and they were celebrating that tradition. And, the Babylonian origin of Easter, we know that the Easter bunny, and the rabbit, we know that was connected to Estar. It's also to Ishtar, way back, the fertility god. Same thing, fertility. We talked about that too. And then, it talks about the Queen of Heaven making cakes. We talked about that also around the hot cross buns. So what does this have to do with the Passover at all? Nothing. It shows you that people are still worshiping the pagan tradition. And if we go to the next slide, we can see where it actually entered into Judaism as well, because they have a month of Tammuz. So when they came back in that second temple period we were talking about earlier, they brought in a new calendar. And that calendar actually has a month of Tammuz based upon the Babylonian calendar that they were coming based upon. And some of them, in some of the traditions, not all Judaism is the same, but in some traditions, they actually weep for Tammuz. They have a time to weep during the time of Tammuz as well. So shows you, there's something going on with some of the traditions that was passed from one to the other. So that's the reason why we go based upon the ancient calendar with some of the months names on the right, and then we just use the ordinal numbers for the ones we don't have. All right, so next. And, just going with Lent, this is, once again, I know people don't like hearing it from me. So, if you go to Shabbat website, that's the some of the more I wouldn't say Orthodox Judaism, but I think they also believe in the what do you call it? Kabbalah. But you see the Zodiac of Tammuz, right? So they talk about it on their site. The Kabbalah, the Kabbalah of the Jewish months. So they'll just go to the website and see what they say. And then at the top, Nehemiah's wall, he used to be Orthodox Jew, and he became what they call a Karaite Jew. So they just supposed to believe in the Old Testament or the Tanakh. They still don't believe in the Messiah, the way that, but they don't believe in all those, the Talmud and all those other, like the woman was talking about halakha and all that stuff. They just believe in the Torah. And he says, don't call the month Tammuz. So he's a Jewish guy, and he's against calling the month Tammuz as well. So this is not just me, a black thing, and like people try to say. But he talks about how they worship. He says echoes of the worship of Tammuz in Jewish traditions. He talks about how Tammuz influenced some of the Jewish traditions as well. So this is not me. This is what he's saying. So go to his site and talk to him and see what he says about it. But we know that there was a weeping for Tammuz, and in the middle you can see Tammuz, and he's holding like something that looks like a cross. I think they'll say it's like some kind of branch or something, but it looks like a cross, right? So that's very interesting that he'll be holding that. And even the early church fathers, so a lot of the European influence that came after during Roman Catholicism and Christianity. Actually a guy named Tertullian, which he was actually a black African, some people say, that actually was pushing some of the Christianity. But he talks about in his book, he said Mithras, so that's the same sun god was worshipped by Constantine. He says seals on their forehead his own soldiers, and he celebrates too an oblation of bread and introduces a representation of the resurrection and purchases a crown under the sword, right? So he said there was a mark that was sealed on their forehead. So he was the sun god. So ashes, sun, you start thinking about some of those things. So a lot of people try to connect that to what they do on Lent and as well as Passover. So next slide. And so this in the Bible, like the guy was saying, Richard Reeves, he said there's no really reference in the Bible to Easter. So there's only one reference if you Google it. Most, some Bibles might have more now, more modern Bibles, but in King James there was only one, and that was because my understanding originally they had it all over the Bible, and then he went back to change it because the timing is different, and they say that he forgot to change it in one place. But even if you look at that word, if you take the King James Bible and look at like NASB, it's no longer Easter. They say Passover, right? Because they know that it was a wrong translation of that word, because they were looking at it through Western European eyes and not through Hebrew eyes, right? The Bible of Hebrews was in Israel, not in Rome. So now they basically try to switch it back to Passover to show that that was the original time. And you can see that even in King James, there's 28 translations of Passover, only one place that they actually say it's Easter. So we can understand the outline of the biblical usage of the word Passover. Actually says it's the 14th day of the month of Nisan. So just like I said, when the crescent moon comes, you count 14 days, and that's supposed to be where you celebrate Passover. All right, so that was the controversy that we showed early on back in 190 AD that they've been fighting and going back and forth ever since. All right, so we know when the original date is, and we know that what people do today is not truly the right time for Passover. So no matter what they say. All right, so next. All right, and that just shows the quarter-decimanism. So somebody who actually used to celebrate on the 14th day will call it quarter-deciman. So when you want to research this, that's a great word to look, because they were fighting over when days they were supposed to fast, what days they're not supposed to fast. They were having this big debate at the beginning after Yahusha left between Christians and Nazarenes. And, Christian and Nazarenes, two different things. Christian was some of those people who was God-fearers, and the Nazarenes were those who were already Israelites from the Hebraic traditions that kept a lot of the feast days from the Bible, but they also believed in the Messiah. So, kind of like who we are today. Now, they got a Nazarene church today that's based on Baptist, has nothing to do. So if you try to go to a Nazarene church, that's not what I'm talking about. But back in the day, the Nazarenes were that way. So next. And this is a letter from Constantine. So just to show what Constantine said about some of this, right? So he had, I think we read this during Purim as well, how they try to get rid of the Feast of Mordecai. They did the same thing with Passover. So this is his letter. I'm not going to read all of it, but it says, when the question relative to the sacred festival of Easter arose, it was universally thought that it would be convenient that all should keep it on one day. For what could be more beautiful and desirable than to see this festival, through which we receive the hope of immortality, celebrated by all in one accord, and in the same manner. It was declared to be particularly unworthy for this, the holiest of all feasts, to follow the customs, the calculation of the Jews. So wait a minute. He says unworthy for them to keep the calculation of the Jews. I thought that was the Bible, right? Who have soiled their hands with the most fearful of crimes, and whose minds were blinded, and rejecting their customs, we may transmit to our descendants the legitimate mode of celebrating Easter, which we have observed from the time of the Savior's passion to the present day, according to the day of the week. So wait a minute. He's saying that they were doing this a long time ago, basically. So we know that even some of the European customs of, Easter with Ishtar came before even Yahusha. So this is interesting that they say that they're the Romans and they're doing it the right day, but the Jews that Yahusha came from are doing it the wrong way. So it says, we ought not therefore to have anything in common with the Jews, for the Savior has shown us another way, showing you that that's not the way of the Bible, but they're trying to say that they were given a more enlightenment, I guess, to do it the way that they wanted to do. So you can see they start talking about some of the anti-Semitic stuff. They said, we desire, dear brethren, to separate ourselves from the detestable company of the Jews. And it says later on, it would be your duty not to tarnish your soul by communication with such wicked people, the Jews. So Constantine was against Jewish people, Israelites, actually, during that time. So he had problems with them, right? And it says later on, he desired to establish only one Catholic church, one unified church. So he was forcing now that for some people, that all people, to celebrate Easter on this day, on the pagan day, not on the Passover day. And he talks about the fasting and stuff. I won't go into all that. But later on, he says not to have anything in common with the murderers of our Lord. And he said we should have nothing in common with the Jews. So it's good to read through that. But you can see how now, say at first in the Acts, the Israelites the disciples were bringing in the Gentiles, right? They were bringing in Timothy, who had a father was a Gentile, but his mama was a Jew, right? So he got circumcised as an adult. So it shows you that he wasn't, following Jewish customs, because Israelite customs, because he would have got circumcised as a child, but he had to get circumcised as an adult. And then you can see, that was Timothy, and then you have Cornelius and so many other people, that's basically converting over and they were kind to them, right? So then the Roman Catholic Church start getting more power, and that's when Hadrian comes. We talked about that, and we talked about that with the Israelites that went to Dimona, and how Hadrian, he had some of those customs, and he kicked all the Israelites out, and he started having Gentile. He's changed from, he killed, the Romans killed a lot of the Israelite bishops, even talks about it even in the Bible, like James and some of the other people that were, and then he replaced the Israelite bishops with Gentile bishops. And the first one that was replaced was called Bishop Marcus. So he was the one that starts changing, the customs where it was led by the Israelites now to be led by Gentiles. And then the church changed to Antioch and then to Rome. And that's when we start getting a lot of the traditions that we know of today. And we can see that in the next thing. So this is the same thing that I showed before, the next one. where they actually were going around in Spain and Portugal and forcing the Jews to convert. And they basically had this thing where they had to read to announce their faith. They said, I renounce the whole worship of the Hebrews, circumcision, all legalisms, unleavened bread, Passover, the sacrifice of lambs, the feast of weeks, jubilees, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, and all the other Hebrew feasts, their sacrifices, prayers, aspirations, purifications, expiations, fasts, Sabbaths, new moons, foods, and drinks. And I absolutely renounce every custom and institution of the Jewish law. So they were forced to say this and forced them to convert to Christianity, to Roman Catholicism, especially I think this is around 700 AD. So right before a lot of the things had actually happened. So, you know, it's definitely different of what's going on now. And this is basically the end. But next slide is just going back to what we talked about earlier. So you can see how a lot of these traditions are things that Yah didn't have for our people, right? That he definitely didn't want this to be what our people were supposed to do. But yet we are still attached to these pagan traditions that he doesn't want even us to associate ourselves with. And especially this one, since we call it after a pagan goddess name, Easter. There's no way to hide this, but yet it shows, you know, just like it talked about how those Israelites were being, you know, kind of mocking Yah, like, I'm going to still do it anyway. Even though I know it's pagan, I'm going to do it anyway. And, you know, what do you think Yah's going to do? You think he's going to give us grace? And, you know, it's one thing when we don't know. But now that we know, it's not like our ancestors, you know, or maybe our grandparents and stuff, you know, they didn't have internet and stuff. This is in libraries, encyclopedias. You can just go and look this up yourself. It's not, but then, like, does it go from a head understanding to a heart understanding, right? Like, are we going to be like Josiah and repent and try to get rid of that stuff? Or are we still going to be living into this paganism that we know with things that mock Yah, that hurt him, right? So that's the reason why when I was a Christian minister, this was some of the things that I was battling with. Because I'm like, after it came to my understanding, I said, I can't keep doing this. You know, it grieved me too bad to know I was grieving Yah, right? So that's why I put the same appeal on other people. But until people are ready, you know, they're going to do what they want to do. Just like it said in the Bible, people said, I don't care. These are the customs and traditions I wanted to do. So, you know, when we stand before him and know that people died for keeping, you know, like even like the Ethiopian Jews, you know, we just showed how they're in poverty, how they're, you know, in bad, and they're trying to still hold on to their traditions. And here we are rejecting ours, being the Israelites and going to assimilate in our, you know, oppressors' religion that was given to, you know, some of our people in slavery couldn't even do these things. But now we got the freedom. We rather go to what was given to us through slavery and being oppressed versus those things that would liberate us and make us whole through the Bible that we all supposed to serve. All right. So anybody there, any questions? No? Shabbat Shalom, cousins. I see LaShonda and LaDon. Thank y'all for joining as well. And, you know, like we have the small version of these videos, but, you know, this is the more thorough, you know, talking about the paganism and everything else. But like I said, I don't want to continue to be, eventually we're going to get off of this, and I don't want to keep on going back to these holidays because people are going to do what they want to do. So now it's out there. It's been documented. That's the reason why I took the time to go through a lot of this information in detail. So now anybody wants to know, they can go look at the video. There's probably millions of videos already out there that they can look at. But it also shows it's a matter of the heart, not a matter of the head anymore. All right? So let us pray. Dear God, we thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for waking us up and helping us to be those dry bones that's coming together, that's understanding who we are. And we still ask for you to give your Ruach HaKodesh within us as a nation of people. We thank you for Yahushua and how he died for our sins to make atonement for, you know, the wrong things that we have done. Even ask you, you know, continue to forgive me for the, you know, my participation into these pagan traditions. And I thank you for the deliverance out of them as well, to not only show me the wrong that I was doing, but also give me the culture to understand what we should be doing as a people, as a whole. So we thank you for this time of liberation. We ask you to also liberate all of our other brothers and sisters, if that's caught up in some of these traditions, and to help them to understand the importance is to serving you and understand your Passover where Yahushua died for our sins and was resurrected, but you already had that in play, already planned out for thousands and thousands of years already. So help us to acknowledge what you have done for us and what you're continuing to do to bring us out, to call us your people of your own, to be that Mamleket Kohanim, that kingdom of priests that truly are devoted to worship and honor you and serving you, but also serving your people, to be the light and even unto the Gentiles, to help those who are in need, to be a vessel of being able to be used by you. We thank you for the purpose that you have given to us. We thank you for the faith in our family. We thank you for all the things you've done, even as our family persecuted us, even as your word says. We know we might just be that seed that might be planted in their hearts later on. And it's just as your son was persecuted by your own people, we know that we will have to bear our cross daily as well. So help us to have strength and continue to learn so we can share to deliver our people from, sin into the right standing with you, where you said that you will redeem us once we turn fully to you with all our heart, all our mind, all our soul, and even all our strength to give you glory, honor, and praise. We ask you to be with those who are sick, those that have, those that's dealing with their parents or their loved ones in ICU. We ask you to be with them, strengthen those who have lost loved ones, even within the family or other families as well. Those that are dealing with job loss in situations, we know that there's a lot of targeting against us, and I feel like this is your way to force us to turn back to you and to exalt your name, to turn to those walls like Hezekiah did, to ask you for forgiveness and ask you for deliverance. And you gave him more years of life, and we ask you to give us even more years to be in your presence, to dwell with you as your people, knowing doing the things that's right. We love you and we praise you in Yahushua HaMashiach's name. We do pray. Hallelujah,